So welcome to the second panel, the first one for the afternoon. My name is Eid Mustafa, and I have the pleasure of introducing the moderator, and he will introduce the speakers. Our moderator for this session is no one other than Professor Osama Khalil. He's a member of the Board of Directors and Associate Professor of History at Syracuse University's Maxwell School of Citizenship and Public Affairs. He's the author of many books, one of which is American Dream Palace, Middle East Expertise, and Rise of National Security State, among others. He doesn't want me to say too much about him. I remember the first time he was invited as a speaker here at the Palestine Center, and I was so impressed. I still remember that time. So without further ado, I'm happy to give the mic to Professor Osama Khalil.
Thank you, Dr. Eid. I'm going to introduce the members of the panel, and then we're going to start first with our esteemed guest who's online today. So our first guest is Shawan Jabarin, who is the General Director of Al-Haq, the first human rights organization in the Arab region. Our second speaker will be Omar Shakir, who is the Israel-Palestine Director at Human Rights Watch. And our third speaker is Zaha Hassan, who is a fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. So please join me in welcoming our speakers, and then they're going to sit up on the table on the bench. So I thought we would begin with you, Shawan. Can you hear us okay?
I hear you well, Dr. Osama.
Is he on mute?
Mute?
Great.
Do you hear me well?
Do you want to try again? Are you still on mute?
Do you hear me well?
Yes, there we go.
Thank you so much. I would like to thank Al-Quds Foundation for organizing this conference. After I heard, the other speakers, which I endorse completely, their messages that they addressed, I have nothing, to add. And I don't want in the same time to repeat what they said. But in the same time, I will try to share a few messages. One of that is the absence of actions is one of the main reasons why the situation continue and deteriorating day after day. This is one of the main things. I think the code in this situation here in Palestine is the actions. And I mean by actions, sanctions. I mean by actions also other means of actions like those they enjoy free visa to go to Europe, for instance. And in the same time, they are criminals, they commit crimes. And in the same time, they enjoy their visa. The other part is in the culture and the policy of impunity. This is an issue because the criminals, if you don't hold them accountable for their crimes, they will commit their crimes again and again and again. That's the case. But my point here in this situation is why the political will is not there, why the double standards is there. I know you know how politics it goes, but even there is, I think, a lesson from history. If you are a superpower today, tomorrow maybe not. And if there is anything happened in a place and you let that happen again, maybe it happened in your house soon. This is an issue. I'm thinking like that strategically, how the politicians and the policymakers, for instance, how they look at the things. We have been saying that occupation is bad, occupation is illegal, occupation is a crime. What's going on in Palestine, it's a crime against humanity. it's war crimes. And we feel these days, it's happened also in other part of the world. Just recently, we hear something like that. The question here is why they reacted in a different way. I think this is one of the questions that I'm not just asking only, but there are others asking this in the South and the rest of the South. I am, moving and flying from place to another, and I engage with the people like human rights defenders, civil society, others, and I hear that well. In the South, they are asking question, why it's happened in this way, but it doesn't happen in the same way, for instance, when it comes to other places, mainly Palestine. The third point, I think Palestine is a test for the international law and for all of these principles. These principles, it's not a Palestinian invention. These principles came as part of a horrific lessons that were learned after the two world wars, the second and the first, and this is part of the lessons. The question is, do we need third world war, for instance, to wake up the conscience? That's an issue I think we have to address to ourselves, to the politicians, to everyone. What's going on in Palestine, I think setting a precedent, bad precedents. And when you set a bad precedents, it will be repeated by the others, and maybe they use it in a way or another. They feel that they can, for instance, flee from accountability, and they can commit any kind of crimes, and nothing will happen against them. The other point I have is practical point. Why the last election, for instance, the people, many people, they were shocked and surprised. Why they have to surprised? Netanyahu, Gavir, and the others, it's easy for them, for instance, to say to the Israelis, hey guys, we did everything. Always they try to frighten you from what's going on here. If we do this, maybe the reactions will come there. Nothing happened. We're expanding the settlements, the colonies, I mean, and we continue killing Palestinians. We beaten the Palestinians severely. We attack Gaza. You enjoy everything, guys. Their water, natural resources, the view, everything. And nothing happened against us. They're right. Yeah, Netanyahu is right, to be honest with you. This is an issue, you know, practically speaking, that's the case. And I think the code here, the absence of consequences and reactions and actions, that's the main thing. I think the Europeans, the West in general, it's not just, you know, to say international community. What's the international community? To be honest, means if it's leading by the West in general, the US main leader in that, and they support Israel unconditionally and blindly in all levels, financially, militarily, politically. Even today, you know, they voted additionally to other 16 countries against the resolution. If you want to close the door before Palestinians, not to use illegal means, legal institutions, peaceful ways, what do you want Palestinians to use? That's to defend their rights, fundamental rights. This is an issue, I think, that we are addressing. Because of that, I think one of the main challenges that we are facing as a human rights defenders, how to maintain hope in people's minds. Mainly how to maintain hope in the young generation's minds. This is, they see the killing as a daily practice. They see the house demolitions, the eviction, and also the, you know, the displacement actions in the rest of West Bank, for instance, the siege over Gaza. Even during summer, we have no water to drink. We have no running water to drink except one day a week in Ramallah. That's just Ramallah. They called it the capital, just once a week. In the same time, the settlers, they enjoy 24 hours a day, 365 days a year, running water, swimming pools, and everything like that. 12,000 settlers, they take water 40% of what 2.5 million Palestinians in West Bank. They are taking, the 11 or 12,000 settlers in Jordan Valley, 40% of what out of the 2.5 million Palestinians. This is the issue, I think. I don't want to speak about the facts and what's going on in daily basis, but this is part of the equations. I would like to share with you a few things that I heard, for instance, from politicians. When I ask them about the double standards and selectivity when it comes to the actions and reactions and how they react in Ukraine, I don't compare victims with victims. Completely, I can't compare like that. I am comparing the reactions, and I see the selectivity and the double standards. They said to me, when it comes to Israel, we can't, impose any kind of sanctions. Why? They said, because we have as Europeans, for instance, we have no common positions and we have no consensus. Okay. What's about the apartheid? They said the apartheid also, we have no common position regarding this, but by time we don't know what will happen. As it was said here by speakers, apartheid, settler colonial regime, it's a reality and it's a fact. That's the case. And I know well, even, that these countries, those countries, they used to support, the officials, they used to support apartheid regime in South Africa at the last minute. But the one, I think, who carry out the action against South Africa apartheid regime, they were the public and the civil society. That's the case. Because of that, if I put a hope, I put a hope on the public, on the people themselves, more than on the officials, to be honest with you. Okay, we have to continue speaking to them. We have to speak truth to the powers. This is very important, but I think we have to speak to the students in the universities. We have to speak to the civil society. We have to write in the media, and mainly to use the social media and the new techniques to address our message and the reality also on the ground. That's the issue. The third point is the language. The language, it was said, many things was said by Francesca, by Phyllis, by Gidon, by the other speakers. It's a clear, in that. I will not add more than what they said. When it comes to the civil society, our mission is to defend people's rights, victims' rights, that's the case, rule of law, and fighting for justice. This is our mission. The Israelis, when they target us for one main reason: to silence us, to get us down, that's the case, to close us, and the minimum to start defending ourselves only, but not to defending the rights of the people. But it will not happen. I will not speak about the designation. I deal with it as if it's not exist, for one main reason, because fighting for justice and rule of law and the principles of equality and rights, it's not a job and it's not a picnic, and we know that well. We will continue fight for justice, and we will continue cooperate, with the International Criminal Court to hold the criminals accountable. This is an issue, it's easy for us to do. We know maybe we pay, personal price. We are ready even for the personal price, including killings. And the Israelis, they are experts in killings and assassinations. This is a daily practice. Those they kill children in the street, 14 years old, 15, 16, 17, women, men. Those they uprooted families by shelling their houses and attacks them. They are ready to commit any kind of crimes. The question is how to continue, fight, but in the same time, it's a responsibility of all people everywhere. As I said, Palestine is a test. Don't let history to repeat itself. This is the issue, and this is the main message I have. I know that I have a limit time. I will leave something for questions because I prepared something else, and I felt that maybe I repeat the same thing. It was discussed and it was addressed by other colleagues, which I endorse completely all of their messages. But we will not give up. We will not step back. We will continue, even let them do what they want. And we will continue also addressing the main challenge is how to keep a hope in our people's minds and mainly the young generation minds. We know that we are weak when it comes to the institutions, the Palestinian side, the division, democracy, even using, all the effort of Palestinians. This is an issue we are addressing. We know that it's internal issue. We have a very bad situation, to be honest with you. But also this is another side of the story. Rights, to address human rights and justice. We are not selective. And we address, and speak truth to the power all the time, when it comes internally or also externally. Thank you so much. And we are strong enough to continue. And if there is one has to have a fear from the long-term future, not the Palestinians, not the Palestinians. Other point is also the fear. The Israelis, they use which called force, interfering also in internal situation in different places, part of that also in the US, by labeling here, by there, anyone speak, key figures, politicians, parliamentarians, civil society, anyone criticize or speak out clearly and strongly and stand behind the justice and rights, they give him or her a label anti-Semitic and things like that. Anti-Semitism is an issue, to be honest with you, but when you exaggerate and mixing things, it will not work sometimes. They have to concern also from this by using it politically in this way. And here I think to distinguish and to differentiate and to continue addressing things in the right way, this is a very important, this is one of the main challenge also we are facing. In Europe, I feel that they concern more than in US. The space in the US is more, it's better than in Europe. When you go to Germany, when you go to Italy, when you go to Austria, when we feel it really strongly. There is a censorship in all levels. There is a censorship when it comes to address Israel's situation. This is what I try to share with you, and thank you so much.
Thank you, Shawan. Now we're going to turn to Omar.
Great. Well, thank you. Echoing my thanks to everyone. Can hear me okay? Great. Just want to echo my thanks to the Palestine Center, to Dr. Osama. Such an honor to be with a group of colleagues and friends and speak after the great Shawan. As the middle speaker in the middle session, I'll try to sort of be a bit of a bridge to kind of connect what we've heard historically to the contemporary reality, to kind of bridge the the theoretical a little bit with the kind of on the ground and start to peek ahead to the future, which I know where the last session will go today. In particular, I do want to focus on the consensus today in the global human rights movement around Israel's apartheid. We heard a little bit from Phyllis and from the other speakers a little bit about apartheid. What I kind of want to do in this setting is to explain how it is that over the last couple of years, we've developed this consensus in the human rights movement. I won't go too deep into the details of how and why we reached the determination, as I think it'll be familiar for this audience, but I do want to explain why the term matters and why it's critical for the way forward. But let me first start at the Palestine Center by acknowledging that Palestinians have for years, if not for decades, been describing their lived reality as one of apartheid, and not enough of us in the international community listened. Probably even in this very podium, probably going back 10, 20, 30, 40 years. What's happened in the last couple of years is a number of prominent Israeli and international human rights organizations have made an apartheid determination. So how did this happen? Can be a long answer to that question, but what I'll say succinctly is Human Rights Watch has been working on Israel-Palestine for well over 3 decades. When the occupation was getting ready to turn 50, 6 years ago, many of us, well, 5 years ago, but when we started thinking about it 6 years or so in advance, we reflected at Human Rights Watch on our body of work. We realized that we had documented so many different human rights issues, whether it's the killings of people in Gaza, whether it's freedom of movement and the sweeping restrictions, whether it is the demolitions of homes. But our research, as is the nature of all forms of research, including human rights research, focused on particular developments in certain areas. And in the course of doing so, while we felt that the research had helped build out a body of scholarship, in some ways it had contributed to obscuring the underlying reality on the ground, a reality in which one government rules over an area, the Israeli government ruling over the area between the Mediterranean Sea and the Jordan River, where 2 groups of roughly equal size live, and where that government has methodically privileged members of one group, Jewish Israelis, and repressed members of the other group, Palestinians, to varying degrees of intensity. And that simple understanding of that reality needed to be centralized. So what did we do at Human Rights Watch? We asked a different research question. Our question was quite simple. How does Israel treat Palestinians? It might sound like a no-brainer, but in the focus on particular and specific topics, that question added to the focus. So we went about doing research the way Human Rights Watch does research. We did case studies. We looked at the treatment of Palestinian communities next to the treatment of Jewish Israeli communities in different areas, in the West Bank, in East Jerusalem, in Israel, and Gaza. We looked at a range of different sources, including Israeli government policy documents, planning documents. We not only did that, we actually looked back at 3 decades of Human Rights Watch research. We compiled different reports, we put our statistics together. We then looked at the work of our Palestinian and Israeli partners. We took their statistics together and we put together a 200-page description of how Israel treats Palestinians. Wasn't covering every aspect on every issue, but gave a sense of how it relates to issues like access to land, housing, movement, etc. Step 2 was then we applied the law, because that's what we do in Human Rights Watch. We document facts and we apply the law. Under international law, there is a prohibition on severe discriminatory oppression, and it has a name. That name is apartheid. So while apartheid was coined in relation to specific events in Southern Africa, international treaties define it as a universal legal term, including the International Covenant on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. And even more than that, apartheid is defined as a crime against humanity, not only in its separate 1973 convention, but it's one of 11 crimes against humanity set out under the Rome Statute to the International Criminal Court. As a crime against humanity, it basically connotes 3 things, right? You need an act, an intent, and a context. With apartheid, it's inhumane acts, really serious abuses, such as forcible displacement, mass land expropriation. Now, these inhumane acts must take place in a context of systematic oppression or domination by one group of people over another, right? So inhumane acts, systematic oppression. And third and finally, it must be carried out with the intent to maintain the domination by the dominant power over the marginalized community. So intent to dominate, inhumane acts, systematic oppression. We then applied the law to the facts, and we made the determination that Israeli authorities are carrying out the crime against humanity of apartheid against Palestinians. Let me note, we also reached a determination about persecution. Al-Haq has done the same. It's a related crime against humanity. It basically talks about, it's very similar, severe abuses of fundamental rights when combined with a discriminatory intent. Happy to say more in the Q&A, but I won't go into depth. I won't spend much time on how we reach this determination because you've heard from my colleagues. But in general terms, we found that the Israeli government between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea has pursued a policy to maintain the domination by Jewish Israelis over Palestinians, which manifests primarily in their desire to control demographics and land, following the maximum land, minimum Palestinians. And our report methodically traces what that policy looks like, you know, from the denial of the right of return while maintaining the law of return to the 2003 temporary order that effectively bans granting long-term legal status to Palestinians from the West Bank and Gaza married to Israeli citizens or nationals, and onwards, and land, what it looks like to have a formal policy of Judaization of the Negev and the Galilee, 2/3 of the land in Israel, to the Jerusalem municipality, which includes occupied East Jerusalem and its policy to maintain a solid Jewish majority. I can go on and on about plans in the West Bank and how Gaza has turned into a demographic receptacle, an open-air prison holding 2.1 million Palestinians and a 25 by 7 mile territory, so they're off the demographic books to Israel. We then combine that with finding systematic oppression carried out against Palestinians, whether it's the nature of dual regimes, including draconian military rule in the West Bank, whether it's the similar dynamics that persist in East Jerusalem despite its technical formal annexation by Israel, whether it's the crushing closure of the Gaza Strip for 15 years, whether it is the methodical discrimination that Palestinian citizens of Israel face. And then we lay out 5 inhumane acts that we determined, from the sweeping movement restrictions to the forcible transfer of tens of thousands of Palestinians, to the denial of residency rights to those Palestinians, to sweeping massive land expropriation, and finally to the denial of basic civil rights to millions of Palestinians. Now, again, happy to say more. I don't think I need to this audience. So really what I'll sort of move to in the last part of my presentation is why it's so critical that we use the term apartheid. Why does it matter, and why is it key to the way forward? And you heard Phyllis say a little bit about this. The reason for it is that it's critical to shift the paradigm. For too long, the discourse in places like this city, in Washington, D.C., has been utterly disconnected from the reality on the ground. I'm not a doctor, as some in the room, but I do know that the first step to solving a problem is to diagnose it correctly. The wrong diagnosis leads to the wrong set of recommendations. A 55-year occupation, as was said this morning, is not temporary. Denying millions of people their fundamental rights solely because they're Palestinian and not Jewish is not simply a matter of an abusive, prolonged occupation. Democracy, as my friend Hagai Al-Ad, the executive director of B'Tselem, has said, is the rule of the people, not the rule of one people over another. A system methodically engineered to privilege one people at the expense of another is not a conflict between two equal sides. A daily reality of structural violence and repression is not merely a conflict between two equal sides. Apartheid is not some hypothetical future scenario. It may not have even been a hypothetical future scenario when Yitzhak Rabin warned about it in the 1970s, or when Jimmy Carter warned about it in 2006, or when John Kerry warned about it in 2014. It is the lived reality for millions of Palestinians. This isn't just the opinion of Human Rights Watch, right? We already have, and it's not just the opinion of Palestinian civil society. Amnesty International reached a similar determination. More and more UN special rapporteurs, from the one on the occupied Palestinian territory, Michael, Lincoln, Francesca, but also on the special rapporteur on housing, on racism. Several others have reached the same determination. Harvard Law School's International Human Rights Clinic. You have other civil society groups. You have a consensus today among the organizations whose work it is to document this reality, that this is what's taking place. And by the way, in the last year, it's moved beyond human rights organizations. Within Israel, you have the former Director General of Israel's Foreign Ministry, former ambassadors to South Africa, current members of the Knesset, the former Education Secretary. You also have prominent civil society groups, including the main human rights groups, B'Tselem, Yeshtin, Isha, Positions for Human Rights Israel. Beyond Israel, we have more and more civil society voices here in the United States. You have Lawrence Tribe, at Harvard. You have prominent voices on MSNBC. You also increasingly have former government officials. You have the five former European foreign ministers that last 2 weeks ago wrote an op-ed in Le Monde. You have also current governments, South Africa and Namibia, who have been vocal saying that apartheid is the reality for Palestinians, and not just them. At the March session of the Human Rights Council, you have the entire African bloc of countries, the Organization of Islamic Conferences, and the Arab bloc all use the term apartheid. So we increasingly see this consensus being built. And that's part of why it's critical to use the term apartheid. But most importantly, it's critical to use the term apartheid because we need to shake up the status quo. We need to remove the fig leaf. The Israelis have done a favor for us with their elections, as Gideon Levy said. It's hard to maintain that fig leaf, but by shining the light on apartheid, we can help do that. Now, let me be clear. I have briefed dozens of governments on our apartheid report, including this government here in the United States, Germany, you name it. I've been in probably hundreds of meetings talking about this term. In not one meeting has somebody challenged the facts that has led to the apartheid determination. In not one meeting has somebody disputed how we applied the law to the facts, because there simply isn't a rebuttal to it. They instead want to stop the debate by shifting it to attacking us. And of course, the Palestinian human rights groups have faced the most significant attack with this effort to criminalize them. But we need to understand the significance of the fact that there is no rebuttal, because even when you accuse Israel of war crimes, even when you accuse the Israeli government of using excessive force, they can hide behind the fact that these were mistakes. We didn't mean to do it. We can criticize and dispute that analysis, but apartheid stands strong because you're saying there's an intent, a policy, a criminal enterprise to carry out a crime as a matter of policy. And that's critically important. It shifts the framework, it shakes up the status quo. And I'll really end by saying it's also vital because we need to build towards action. Other terms are important, right? Apartheid is not a standalone narrative. Crimes can take place in a context. When you say apartheid, it doesn't negate the reality of occupation, right? Palestinian scholars have for years situated apartheid against the context of settler colonialism. That's an important analysis. You need to read them alongside one another. But apartheid is a legal term, and that's what makes it so powerful. And it's what makes it have teeth. There's a convention that defines what are the obligations on third state actors, on corporations, on individual officials. There are mechanisms for prosecution. So beyond a rhetorical shift, apartheid opens the door to using these legal tools. Now, let's not be under any illusions. These tools will not on their own dismantle apartheid. We need a vision for a future and what it looks like with apartheid dismantled. Apartheid doesn't mean, settlers and Palestinians have equality. There's clear language in all the reporting about dismantling settlements and the underlying rights of Palestinians, the right to self-determination, a fundamental principle of international law. But apartheid does open the door to legal tools. So let's use whatever terms we think are valuable, but we need to put apartheid at the core of our way forward. And with that, I'll stop. Thank you.
Hello, is it working? Okay, good. So first I want to say I'm really pleased to be with my two co-panelists here. I'm a lawyer. These two are my legal heroes, so I'm really pleased to be with them. But I work in policy, so I'm going to try to stay in my lane and talk about U.S. policy and what it has to say about what we see unfolding in Israel-Palestine today. Since we're just coming out of Israeli elections, I want to talk about the role of U.S. policy in the rise of ultra-nationalist parties in Israel, like religious Zionism. The reaction to the Israeli elections among the policymaking community and I think tanks like mine in Washington has been one of surprise and serious concern. I don't understand why the outcome was surprising, however, or why only now is there such an expression of concern, given what the position of the rest of the right wing in Israel has been for decades now. The popularity of ultra-nationalist parties among Israelis and their position on the existence of Palestinians in what they call the land of Israel, which is anywhere in historic Palestine, was buoyed after a Palestinian Arab party dared to join the previous coalition government for the first time. This was an unforgivable outrage to many in Israel. A lot of attention is being placed on the personalities of Itamar Ben-Gvir and Bezalel Smotrich, who head Jewish power and religious Zionism respectively. They are unapologetically racist and Jewish supremacists who support the ethnic cleansing of Palestinians from historic Palestine. You've heard a lot about Ben-Gvir, I'm sure already, but what I want to underscore in this presentation is not the moral repugnancy of individuals like him who adhere to a political ideology born in the US, by the way, that has also been designated by Israel and the US as a terrorist organization. Instead, I want to focus on the political platform of the parties. Individuals can come and go from the political scene, but the ideologies they promote tend to endure and are difficult to undo when they have become normalized. So if you look at, for example, Jewish Power's political platform, it calls for the returning of all parts of the land of Israel to the state for Jewish people. It calls for vigorously taking action to promote Jewish immigration to preserve the land of Israel, to prevent, quote, the plague of assimilation, unquote, and to preserve a Jewish majority. It calls for a war on Israel's enemies that should be total. And it says in the very same sentence that the Arabs should be removed from the land that was taken by Israel in the Six-Day War. It says that under Jewish power, the IDF will no longer just promote a policy of containing the enemy, containing them in the enclaves, whether it's inside of Israel or inside of the occupied territories and Gaza in particular, but it talks about eradicating and destroying the enemy. And they're, be clear, they're talking about Palestinians here. So this language is really chilling. And given what is taking place on the ground currently in the occupied territories with daily incursions, settler violence, and the killing of young Palestinians trying to protect their communities. Those who say that the rise of Jewish power and its ilk in Israel is just a fluke or a temporary blip in Israel's political history, just like the emergence of other fascist parties elsewhere in Sweden or Italy, are not paying attention. The rise of Jewish power and religious Zionism is the natural result of consistent with everything we know about the trend lines in Israel for decades now. It is also the natural result of US policy that has been, wittingly or not, extremely deferential to religious Zionism and ultranationalists. And here I would include Likud and its offshoots. So what does US policy and engagement on Palestine-Israel have to do with the rise of ultranationalism in Israel? Well, it was during the Obama administration that the Pandora's box was opened in US policy, and advocacy for Jewish supremacy in Israel and the occupied Palestinian territories was normalized. This might seem surprising to you, given that President Obama's personal and professional background seemed to be one sympathetic with legal principles and with anti-discrimination. He was a community organizer and someone who was a constitutional law professor. But before I get to how this happened in US policy, I need to give you a little background on how open advocacy of ethno-religious supremacy became normalized in Israeli politics, paving the way for the ascendancy of Ben-Gvir and Smotrich. It all begins in early October 2000, when Israeli police shoot and kill 13 Palestinians, 12 of whom are citizens of Israel. Ironically enough, these Palestinians were protesting the killings of other Palestinians in the occupied territories by the IDF. Those days of mass protest came to be known as the Al-Aqsa Intifada, the second Palestinian uprising against Israeli occupation. Ariel Sharon set off the uprising when, as a part of his relaunch of his political career, he took hundreds of armed Israeli police to the Haram al-Sharif mosque in Jerusalem and declared that Jerusalem was for Jewish Israelis and would not be a shared capital. After a 5-year independent Israeli investigation, the killing of the 12 Palestinian citizens of Israel and a Palestinian resident of Gaza was ruled to have been unlawful. The Israeli police snipers who killed the protesters did so knowing that they were unarmed and posed no threat. Now, despite these findings, the police officers involved were never charged, and in 2007, the Israeli Attorney General closed the file. The message to the Palestinian citizens of Israel was clear. Palestinians are not equal citizens, and there can be no justice or equality for them in Israel. This sense that Palestinians could not receive justice spurred forth a series of meetings between 2005 and 2007, organized by the Palestinian leadership inside Israel. These are legislators, civil rights leaders, public intellectuals. The product of the meetings was 2 documents. The first was a strategy paper called The Future Vision of Palestinian Arabs in Israel, which asserted the indigeneity of Palestinians in Israel and declared that, quote, defining the Israeli state as a Jewish state excludes Palestinians and creates tension between Arabs and Jews. Therefore, the document called for a consensual democratic system that would guarantee Palestinians equal rights to Israeli Jews. The second document published was called the Democratic Constitution. Now, this was drafted by Adala Legal Center for Arab Minority Rights in Israel. And it basically called for full equality for Palestinian Arabs in Israel. It also called for a recognition of a Palestinian state in the occupied territories with the 1967 borders. The Israeli government's response was to these documents came a few months later, on the eve of the Annapolis talks. Prime Minister Ehud Olmert told the Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas that the PLO would have to recognize Israel as a Jewish state as a part of any comprehensive peace agreement. This was the very first time that recognition of Israel as a Jewish state was made a part of the peace talks between Israelis and Palestinians. Olmert was essentially saying that not only would Palestinian refugees not be allowed to return to the state of Israel, but that the status of Palestinian citizens of Israel would also be put on the negotiating table. This is not me reading something into Olmert's demand. Between 2007 and 2008, Tzipi Livni, the then Israeli foreign minister who was part of Olmert's negotiating team during the Annapolis talks, told Palestinian negotiators that a state of Palestine should be the, quote, full and comprehensive solution to both the refugee issue and the claims of the entirety of the Palestinian people, including those who may have become citizens of other states. Livni then proposed that Israel cede towns where some 300,000 Palestinian citizens of Israel reside to a future Palestinian state and strip them of their Israeli citizenship. Peace talks with Olmert ultimately ended because of his indictment on corruption, and Benjamin Netanyahu succeeded him as prime minister in 2009. In his famous Bar Ilan speech in 2009, in which Netanyahu is erroneously credited with accepting the two-state solution, Netanyahu expanded on the matter of Palestinian recognition of Israel. He said, quote, the fundamental condition for ending the conflict is the public, binding, sincere Palestinian recognition of Israel as the national homeland of the Jewish people. Netanyahu said that he told President Obama that if Palestinians do this, Israel would be ready to sign a peace agreement. Note the difference between Olmert and Netanyahu's formulation. Olmert called for recognition of a Jewish state of Israel, while Netanyahu called for a national homeland of the Jewish people to be agreed by Palestinians even before Israel's borders were declared. Olmert's formulation still allowed for the borders of the Jewish state to be based on the 1967 Green Line, though he wanted the hundreds of thousands of Palestinian citizens of Israel and Palestinian refugees to be resettled in the West Bank and Gaza that might become a Palestinian state or elsewhere outside of Israel's agreed borders. Netanyahu's formulation, however, required Palestinians to accept that Jewish people had superior rights in the occupied West Bank as well. the biblical land of Israel, with no clarity on what would be the status of Palestinian citizens of Israel, refugees, or even those living in the occupied territories. Instead of understanding how problematic what Olmert and Netanyahu were asking for was, after 2 years of being unable to get negotiations going, the Obama administration succumbed to Netanyahu's demand. So in May 2011, Obama announced, quote, "The America and the international community should state frankly what everybody knows. A lasting peace will involve 2 states for 2 people, Israel as a Jewish state and the homeland of the Jewish people, and the state of Palestine as the homeland of the Palestinian people, each state enjoying self-determination, mutual recognition, and peace." Now, in Obama's view, everyone knew that Palestinians had to recognize that a yet undefined Israel was the homeland of the Jewish people and concede this before negotiations could begin on a comprehensive agreement. The political recognition the US was demanding from Palestinians became not about a border between Israel and a future Palestinian state. It became about the exclusive identity of the people within some amorphous territorial unit nowhere defined on a map. So Obama's adoption of Netanyahu's formulation as a US parameter for peace completely undermined Palestinian nationality and gave the continued residence of Palestinians anywhere between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea. It made it insecure and dependent on the magnanimity of Israel as the rightful landlord. Following Obama's speech, Avi Dichter, a leader in Tzipi Livni's Kadima party, prepared the first draft of the basic law, Israel as a nation state of the Jewish people, which guarantees Jewish supremacy in the area between the Mediterranean Sea and the Jordan River. Why did Tzipi Livni and Avi Dichter's Kadima party draft this law? Ironically, both the Likud and Kadima parties were infuriated by Obama's 2011 speech, even though he gave them what they had been asking for on Jewish recognition. They were upset because Obama had referenced the pre-June 4th, 1967 borders as the basis for determining the territorial unit for Jewish self-determination. Now, despite the threat of the passage of the basic law, with just days before President Trump would take office, Secretary Kerry gave a very long speech warning about Israeli settlement expansion and what it would mean for Israeli Jewishness. Despite putting the majority of the blame on Israel for the failure of the talks he sponsored, he reiterated that Palestinians must recognize Israel as a Jewish state and homeland of the Jewish people as a prerequisite to relaunching final status talks. He made this the second most important parameter on his list of requirements for an Israeli-Palestinian peace agreement. Now, I won't go into too much detail about why Kerry thought that this was something that the UN partition plan required. It was a gross mischaracterization of the UN partition plan. But the Jewish nation state law that was advanced by Kadima, a party left of Likud, is not so different than the Jewish power platform. If you look at the Jewish nation state law, what does it do? It says Jews have an exclusive right to self-determination in the state of Israel. This means Palestinians do not have a legal right to citizenship inside Israel, though they are the indigenous people. It says in another provision that Jewish people's historic homeland is the, quote, land of Israel. Now, Israel has never defined its borders as a state, and a Jewish homeland is not defined in the basic law. We know, however, that the term land of Israel refers to Judea and Samaria, the occupied West Bank. So if Israel annexes the West Bank, the basic law states that it will become land for the exclusive right of Jewish self-determination. But before Israel formally takes action to annex any parts of the Jewish homeland, a third provision encourages and promotes the establishment and consolidation of Jewish settlement in those areas. So as long as Israel leaves its borders undefined and fails to guarantee equality before the law for all of its citizens, these three provisions in the Jewish nation state basic law read together provide constitutional authority for the complete displacement of Palestinian Arabs from historic Palestine, a justification for the denial of refugee return and the denial of equal rights for all under law. So you can see that though the Jewish power platform is more explicit in talking about eradicating the enemy, it basically calls for the same things that are under the Jewish nation state basic law with a stamp of approval on top of it from US in US policy. So I'll stop there.
I know we're gonna have a lot of questions, but I just want to pose a few that you can all respond to this from different perspectives. I'm really not seeing the comments. So I'm curious, and Omar Shawan or Zaha, if you want to start. Omar, you talked about the reaction when you meet with different policymakers to the reports, and no one challenges you on the term. And I'm curious whether the lack of action by the international community has paved the way for the exact government that Zaha just described. And I'd like the others to join us to respond as well.
I think Shawan answered this best. In his remarks. I mean, if you're an Israeli voter going to the elections and you see that the Israeli government has done whatever it wants, I mean, let me make it clear, this is the Lapid Bennett government. We today, as I'm sitting and speaking to you today, we have I think 17-year high in the number of Palestinians in administrative detention, 832 as of November 1st, held without trial or charge. We have depending on the data set you look, 15-year high in killings of Palestinians in the West Bank. We have the criminalization of not only the most respected civil, among the most respected civil society groups in Palestine. We have, I mean, Al-Haq's been around. I spoke in 2019 from Ramallah at Al-Haq's 40th anniversary. I mean, one of the most respected human rights organizations in the entire globe, in the Global South, partners of Human Rights Watch. Shawan sits on Human Rights Watch's advisory board, Middle East advisory board. So, these moves were taken by this government. So what's the message to an Israeli voter when you see that Israel does what it wants and can get away with it? Why would you vote for anything other than not only a continuation, but an acceleration of the status quo? So I think absolutely the impunity that exists, the fact that the Israeli government, faces no consequences for it, absolutely has propelled it to keep pushing the envelope, whether it's on attacks on civil society, abuses on the ground, or the type of government that's there. People forget. I mean, we heard a reminder this morning about Sharon in 1982. People forget. I mean, Lieberman is now put in the left camp. The world reacted to Lieberman similarly, not even 7, 8 years ago, and now Lieberman is seen differently. Bennett was viewed the same. I mean, it's incredible the way in which the goalposts continue to move. So absolutely. So what I meant to say, just to finish that point, I meant to say that nobody challenges the facts, the merits. It's not that they agree with the term. They'll find other reasons to say, well, it's not our place to do it. It's a legal term. We need a legal ruling. But the actual facts are not challenged, which is significant.
You want to add to that? From the perspective of Al-Haq? Can you hear me? Zaha, do you want to jump in while we, at least from the perspective of policymakers, what this looks like?
Sorry. Thus far, sort of the reaction from the Biden administration to to what's been taking place, particularly the Israeli elections, has been to say, well, let's just wait and see. We don't know what files the racist Jewish supremacist parties are going to have. So let's wait and see what happens. The problem with that sort of perspective is that, it's very clear what they want to do. And it's very clear they have a lot of leverage with this government, and that they seek the very ministries that are going to have control over Palestinians, whether they're Palestinian citizens of Israel or whether they're living in the occupied territories. I think it's critically important for them to put down red lines now. Red lines like absolutely they should not be given the Public Security Ministry or the Department of Defense, and it looks very likely that they might get the Department of Defense. So I think that the administration, unfortunately, has been extremely derelict with respect to trying to put some reins on Israel in this regard, and I don't see it changing. And I'm very concerned because right now we see, as Shawan was talking about, a real escalation on the ground. It very much looks like a third intifada to me. the Israeli incursions, the settler violence. There's going to be a moment where there's going to be this fog of war, kind of a sense by the international community, and things happen during those moments. And so I'm very concerned that if something isn't done now to rein in these parties and put some demands on the Israeli government, that's the kind of thing that might happen.
Shawan, do you want to respond or add a perspective on the talk? You're muted. You're muted.
Sometimes when you start speaking, I don't hear you very well. And regarding the question, I think I'm thinking loudly, to be honest with you. Israel, they have one strategy only one strategy: force, force, and force. Killing, destructing, cleaning areas here, there from Palestinians. This is what they do. This is the only strategy. There is nothing called peace. There is nothing called international law. And this culture also, or this practice and this policy became deeply, deeply in their culture and in their policy, because there is no actions and there is no price to pay. Why they have to rethink? And when we ask for reactions or sanctions or something like that, I think it will build, let me say, the question why in their minds. This is important. Without a question why inside the Israeli society, nothing will change. Nothing will change. I think if the question why start, when you take actions, the question why will start. Oh, why they imposing sanctions over us? Why they, for instance, listing the settlers, leaders here not to enjoy free visa and not to go to the US or elsewhere? Things like that is important. And the Israeli community or society is sensitive when anything's taken by, let me say, the US or by the Europeans. But they feel that they enjoy everything and nothing happened against them. This is the thing. Another thing is, for instance, our new generation, they are also learning from before. These days, they think that the Israelis, they know one language only, force. If you are with or not, things like that, this is something else. For instance, they said the Israelis, they recognize the UN Security Council relating to South Lebanon 425 when the last Israeli tanks left Lebanon in 2000. I still remember Ehud Barak, 5 o'clock early morning, when the last tank of Israel left South Lebanon, he said Israel recognized UN Security Council and implemented UN Security Council Resolution 425. This is an issue. We are asking, for the implementation and for respect UN resolutions relating, to Palestine. Nothing happened. Investigation commissions, nothing happened. More than that, when you speak about international law, you are anti-Semitic. You are hate, inciting against Israel, things like, if you close all the doors before the Palestinians, peaceful, legal, all means, what you left for them? And in the same time, by help, by the US veto, for instance, pushing Palestinians not to address this question or that question. Even the latest call between Blinken and Mahmoud Abbas is to pressure Mahmoud Abbas to withdraw the draft resolution before the General Assembly, which it's passed today. It's passed, there. Things like that. This has happened. What you left for Palestinians? This is, I think, the main question. What do you want from Palestine? To disappear? We will not disappear. And we see that the new generation is more stronger than the others standing in the right square, defending their rights. And they don't believe about even their leadership. To be honest with you, things are changing. And we see also there are some positive signs here or there in the international level, but it's not at the official level. Because I divide, the international community for two. One is official and one is public. And I put a hope on the side of the public international community. Because of that, we have to work there and to address them, the public, I mean, everything that we have. Facts, narrative, language, analysis, all of these things. Thank you. I don't hear. Can't hear you. Are you muted?
Begin to talk about a policy of genocide, a deliberate policy of genocide. And when do we get to that point? Because this is deeply embedded in a settler colonial mentality and a settler colonial project. There are, as you know better than I do, there are very key criteria to genocide, to the genocide code in international law, and language is one of them. Especially this kind of language in which they're openly describing ethnic cleansing and the need for ethnic cleansing. So I want to turn that over to the human rights experts and see what you think. Shawan, do you want to take it?
Yes, I heard the last part, it's about genocide. To be honest with you, we are studying this, legally speaking. As a professional organization, we try not just to address new terms or using a new language without studying that very well. But this is now under our legal study.
Genocide is a legal term, it has a definition. Courts have set the threshold for it at a very, very high level. I think that needs to be understood. So Human Rights Watch, the way we operate, which is maybe different than other organizations, we don't write legal briefs. So we're not writing positions where there is some debate on both sides, right? I mean, the evidence of apartheid was so overwhelming, right? So I documented the crimes against humanity committed by Egyptian authorities when they killed protesters in Rabaa and other demonstrations. And there, the evidence was, we were there, we documented, it was overwhelming, but we said likely crimes against humanity because the evidence we had of government planning was pretty extensive, but we thought we didn't have, with the Israeli apartheid, there was not a single person in the entire Human Rights Watch review process that said we should caveat it. But my point is that we don't write legal briefs, we document facts, we apply the law. When it comes to genocide, we haven't looked at it, but I suspect that given where the threshold is, it's something where it could be argued, given because the way the definition is written. So that makes it less likely that Human Rights Watch would, look at it. But we certainly are open to anything, and we'll see where, Al-Haq or others write on it. It's something we'll look at.
So how do you want to describe this perspective?
Well, I would just say that that word is not just a legal term, right? It's also a political term, and it's understood in very specific ways, particularly by the Jewish community and by policymakers in Washington. So I think part of the discussion around when is it appropriate to use that word and when it is not would be looking at to the extent to which it would help protect the Palestinian population on the ground. What is the potential for having it protect? Now, I will say that when the apartheid reports came out with Human Rights Watch and Amnesty, the response from the DC policy space was very much like, okay, we're not going to get into a discussion around whether there's any opposing evidence to what Human Rights Watch or Amnesty said in its reports, but what people were saying, experts were saying is, does this help? How does this get the two parties to negotiate? How does this actually move the needle between Palestinians and Israelis? And, that's, obviously, means that we basically don't do anything or say anything or call things out for what they are. But there is something to be said for like being strategic here. So, and using that term, I agree with Ahmad that you better be really on it in terms of the legal evidence for using that terminology, because there's going to be an avalanche in response back because of the sensitivities around using that kind of terminology that harkens back to other eras and such. So, but that isn't to say that we shouldn't use it. That is just to say that it needs to be thought out and the case made legally very clearly.
So I'll put this caveat out. When 2011, Muammar Gaddafi was, and that was used to justify the intervention, right, by NATO. And so my fear is that we'll start talking about genocide after Jewish power does what it plans to do, right? And then when there's overwhelming evidence, it'll be too late. So I'll turn it over. That's my comment, Professor Messa.
Thank you. I was wondering sort of the question of apartheid. We know that, let's say, and we know that those.
Can you hear me? Yeah. We know that both B'Tselem and Human Rights Watch, when they both released their, Human Rights Watch, of course, followed B'Tselem, and it seems to me, and I correctly if I'm wrong, Omar, it seemed to have been encouraged that an Ashkenazi Jewish organization already described Israel as apartheid before Human Rights Watch did. And of course, the issue, and this is very important, is that both organizations claimed that their judgment of apartheid on Israel was not based on some recent policy, but actually to what Israel has been doing since 1948. So my question is, so why did it take so long for Human Rights Watch and B'Tselem and subsequently Amnesty International to accuse Israel of apartheid, if indeed the judgment is that it had always been an apartheid system since 1948? What changed within the organization or the discourse of human rights to produce that?
Thanks, Professor Massa, for the question. So first is that like, okay. No, so to your question, no, there wasn't a sort of coordination around this. And B'Tselem, very important, it was 8 pages. So by the time they had written theirs, our report was 220. Our report was 223 pages. So our report was well along. Our report, I know you had to deal with this, so maybe it's fitting that I respond to your question, but I have the same interference. But so it was, it was actually just the timing, right? So B'Tselem at the time they had gotten approval from their board, and it was in the context of Israeli elections, and they wanted to put that out there in the coverage of Israeli elections. So it fits both their advocacy strategy and the timing of their board approval. Similarly, for Human Rights Watch, we have a very rigorous internal review process. By the time the report finished the review process, we released it as soon as we can afterwards. So the timing, we were in coordinate. I mean, we were in touch. We knew that it was coming, but it wasn't a case of you go first, we'll go after you. Because you could argue it, we should have done the same day then, because then it would have been the same. But it was just, this is when it was ready. They had also a moment with Israeli elections. We went a bit later. So I'm getting to that question. So your question of why now is a really good one. So there's a legal and there's a factual answer. So let me start with the legal answer. Legally, apartheid is a crime against humanity, going back to the 1973 Apartheid Convention. And it also is under the 1998 Rome Statute. But I think for most people, it wasn't seriously thought of in Israel-Palestine until Palestine acceded to the Rome Statute in 2015, because that's when suddenly there was a court that had jurisdiction over the crime. So that suddenly created sort of a legal impetus for us to say, whoa, now a court has jurisdiction. Do we need to look at this more closely? But there's also a factual answer. You're right that many of the abuses that underlie apartheid date back years, if not decades. But one thing, again, when I answered the genocide question, I said we don't write legal briefs. If there's any possible dispute of the, we're not going to go there. So what big thing that shifted factually was remember I said 3 elements: intent, inhumane acts, and systematic oppression. The intent part of the analysis, Israel hid behind, and I'm not saying it was necessarily credible, but for a long time it would argue settlements are temporary. It would go to court and argue that these, that this is not what meant perpetuity, peace process. But over the last 5-6 years, they dropped that pretext. It manifests in many ways. One is the nation state law that you mentioned, but beyond the nation state law, you had Netanyahu and others directly saying, no, we intend to rule over Palestinians in perpetuity. We want to keep it over. So when you had and then it wasn't just words, the infrastructure, the kind of massive influx, then the annexation debate, those facts made it impossible to deny that an intent transparently was there to dominate Palestinians in perpetuity. So when you had the legal, and then the third factor is what I said in my remarks about the way we analyze things. Instead of looking at Gaza movement, freedom to build in what East Jerusalem, we took a different scope of analysis. We looked at the question of the treatment of Palestinians writ large. So when you take those 3 things, the legal shift with 2015, combined with the intent evidence becoming so overwhelming, combined with the different research question we asked, how does Israel treat Palestinians, it led us to that point. Were we late? I think certainly it's a fair critique and argument, certainly to make, but that's sort of what explains the timing.
I know you didn't make the decision, but
Yeah.
I wanted to say that HRW is state by its own standard. It claimed that since 1948, the Israeli government has set up the military or martial law with Palestinian citizens.
Yeah.
So it is acknowledged that it is these type of policies since 1948. So my question is, will HRW go back to all its previous reports on Israel and correct them, saying that they will just state it like that, describe what was actually unfolding as apartheid? I realize you're not.
Yeah, no, but the answer, I can answer that question by saying, we don't claim when the threshold, our report does not, it's called the threshold crossed, but we don't say when the threshold is crossed. It's because we're not historians, right? That's the job of academy. Was it apartheid in 48? Was it in 67? That's not the question we set out to answer in the report. When this is the first time we looked and actually applied the law, and we reached the conclusion that undisputedly, undeniably, it's apartheid. Was it apartheid in 94? Was it apartheid in 76? I can't answer that question. We don't do that. We made the determination when we made it. We can question why we looked at it now and not before, but we didn't claim it's apartheid any other time beyond when we were listening.
Salem said it has always been apartheid, but they also described it.
I don't think it's quite how they worded it, but we can discuss it. We can debate it more. Yeah.
Thank you. Just to follow up on this debate, because it's all about language ultimately, and the point that Zaha has brought up, that is, well, is it really helpful? It is genocide. We all know it's genocide, but we can't say it is genocide. Now, that's what is so problematic for us. We remember our history and struggle against Amnesty International in particular, that kind of constantly equated during the Second Intifada between the Palestinians killed and the Israelis killed, and this kind of moral equivalence they have created. Now that presents a problem for us Palestinians, because if I am going to wait for the so-called international community to come to terms with the fact that it's apartheid, genocide, crimes against humanity, crimes against peace, and crimes of aggression, and all the other crimes, it might take a very, very long time for that to happen. It's like you have to achieve a paradigm shift and start calling things what they deserve to be called, as opposed to have the courage to speak out now and hope that the rest is going to catch up with you later.
What I would say to you is, human rights groups have a mandate. We have law and humanitarian human rights law. Movements shouldn't be limited by those particular constraints. We have a mission, we apply it, we do it. But that's separate from what organizations should be calling for, should be doing. You know, it's, we hope our reports help with advocacy, but ultimately it's subject to those particular ways of doing things. So my only point is just to say, you know, human rights groups have a role to play, but they also, there's a role to be played by Palestinians, by their, you know, leadership, by Israelis, by advocacy groups, you know, that are not as limited as they are by what a mandate might be.
Shawan, do you want more to add to this discussion? Years. You're muted again.
Language is important, but I think also looking at the facts on the ground, this is very important. As a professional organizations, for sure, they have to take care of their language and study it on the basis of international law principles. This is important, but it doesn't mean that the think tank centers or groups, they have not to study it. For instance, politicians, political science, all of these things, it's important and related. But what's the common main things is the situation on the ground, what's going on. For instance, this is very important. Now you brought the issue of genocide. Genocide, to be honest with you, yeah, there is also a legal study and discussion about these things, and it's not just from our side, or no, even international scholars these days, they are thinking and they are writing about these things. But it doesn't mean that what's going on the ground, it's terrific, and it's against all of these principles, mainly the fundamental rights, right of return, the daily practices. This is important, but when you arrive to use this term or that term, I think it has not to limit the work of the others and the politicians to intervene, because it's clear that international crimes committing in the occupied Palestinian territory and against Palestinians in general. No sound.
Blatantly unapologetic racist parties in the Israeli government is that no one's talking about restarting negotiations. No one's really, using the mask of a two-state solution to try to camouflage this. I think it's going to be a lot harder for the think tank space, the DC policy making space to fall back on what we fall back on in the past, which is to say, well, we don't want to upset the parties. If we criticize Israel too much here, they won't participate in the negotiations. I mean, that was the reason why Obama decided to accept the parameter, was requiring Palestinians accept a Jewish homeland, wherever that might end up being, was because he wanted to get the parties back to negotiation. So he threw this parameter out there that actually was incredibly destructive and really emboldened these ultra nationalists in Israel. So I think we're far beyond that now. We're far beyond that now, and I think we're going to have to come to terms with this. And I think folks in the DC policy space understand that. They understand that this is they're not going to be able to sugarcoat this one, with talk about a peace agreement, and that we don't want to disturb it. So yeah.
I think we'll work with some of the questions in a slightly different way. I think historically there's this feeling that both policy organization and the so-called human rights sector puts a ceiling on Palestinian limits. Puts a ceiling also on the way we frame our struggle. It actually restricts our framing
In the same way that in general, our framing has been always subject to enormous pressures from state actors, non-state actors. And this is, of course, a sign of the absorption of the Palestinian sphere into this realm, where it has to appeal to these organizations, or at least engage with them, for the lack of a national leadership at the moment. I mean, it's a sign of our own internal collapse in a way. Had we had a very powerful, vigorous PLO, to be quite honest with you, we wouldn't care what Human Rights Watch says, because it would be like the FLN back in the day, or like the PLO in its 80s. We'd be able to take our agenda, tell you the way it is. And if you don't like it, you don't like it. You know, you'd just be exposing yourself as an organization operating in the Western orbit. Now, I do think you guys have done actually a great job in shifting this framework, even though it came very, very late, as Professor Massad said. But is there some introspection on this dynamic, on placing a ceiling, on restricting the discourse, on even saying things that are not true when you couch this language for marketing with American audiences? For example, you in your own talk, I mean, I love the work that you do, but at the same time, when you tell me Yitzhak Rabin warned of apartheid, I cringe. Like from an anti-colonial perspective, this is a war criminal of the highest order. You're actually, as a Human Rights Watch representative, forced in a way to quote him so that you can present your message to an American audience. Same with Jimmy Carter. You know, when he published this book, I had a confrontation with him over the right of return. He came to speak in a distinguished venue. I was like, well, what about refugees? He's like, Israel has a right to not have this, to have a Jewish majority, this and that, you know? So how do we deal with this issue? And I'm asking it in a genuine way. Yeah.
So I'll say two things. One is to separate the two things out. My point was just to say, when you talk about apartheid among audiences that haven't embraced it, it's often the future tense. And there was an acceptance of it in future tense. So my point of mentioning those folks was to say even those people used it in the future tense. So if you can't believe the term, look at how long ago and how they warned about it. So it's more to point out how, the clarity of it. But I think it's a really good question. I think this might be a good one for Shawan to answer as well, because I think ultimately I would see it in the inverse way, right? It's not that human rights groups set or remove ceilings, right? It's more that human activists and movements use many tools, law is one of them, to advance their struggle. I also think that there has to be a deference to Palestinian voices and Palestinian civil society. It's why much of our focus, Zaha's focus, my focus is on al-Haq and the work they do. But ultimately, I would say that the impact of years of advocacy by Palestinians is part of what's causing a shift widely, not just with human rights organizations, humanitarian groups, civil society. It's actually coming to terms and reconciling, and it's the result of people like Shawan and others who have for years and decades been pushing this advocacy forward. But absolutely, I mean, I think as I said earlier, right? I mean, the law is a limited tool. We all know that. I don't need to tell that to folks here. But that's what we operate within. So Human Rights Watch is invariably going to make, and we also don't take sides on any type of, not what we're talking about here, it's not about sides, we're talking about facts, and we take the side of victims. But when there is a situation of occupation, we don't, or war, whether it's Iraq or Russia, and you can criticize that, but that's our mandate, is not to take a position on. No, but
that's the point of the audience.
Yeah.
Is there a mechanism for revisiting mistakes?
Yeah.
You've had 30, 40, whatever, since you were started.
Yeah.
You've had, you should, until recently, you should.
No, but okay, so, but you're saying that about a party. What I'm saying is, when it comes to sort of like taking one side in a war or conflict, we don't do that. We document abuses and we expose them, whatever the side of the perpetrator is. So my point is just to say that's a limited mandate. And I think it's important to use these reports, to use legal language where it's relevant, but it shouldn't be the ceiling, is my point. It should be seen the other way around, that human rights groups help provide analysis and tools that can advance a solution, but that's not the end all be all. But I'm curious.
You want to add?
Look, I think this is one dimension. It's not the all dimensions, and we can't put, the eggs in one basket because there are different players, politicians, diplomats. The field also, it has its own language. The public, it has its own language. But when it comes to the human rights organizations and the professional organizations, the question is if they are standing strongly behind these principles or not. If they are ready to make a compromise with these principles or not, because of the political situation here or there, because at the end we are moving also, we are part of the society. This is the case. And here maybe you can see some differences for different readings, for different political position here or there. That's the case. We are trying to take, to be honest with you, the principles of the international law. For instance, when we speak about fundamental rights, right of return to the refugees, we don't shy saying this since the beginning. When we say that our refugees, they have to go back to their homes, to their land, to their property. Politically speaking, the politicians, they look at it as this is bad, maybe. This is not good, maybe it's not a time. This is their land. To stand behind the principles. And I think this is an issue. When we say, for instance, self-determination, we mean it self-determination for Palestinian peoples and not for part of the people. The other thing is we have to define who is the Palestinians. The Palestinian people is an issue. And when they say, let me say peace, can we get a peace and a stable peace without justice? This is an issue. What's the justice means? That's an issue, I think. When we speak about peace, what's the content of this peace? That's the issue. When they speak about, let me say, land swap is against the international humanitarian law because you try to legalize, for instance, the illegal. Do you have a right to legalize the illegal? For politicians, yes. I'm sure that they are ready even to legalize the crimes. That's the case. And here our voice, I think it's important. To stand behind the principles is important. At the end, the human rights also, it's a liberal part. The question if you want to work on that or not, this is something else. But when we choose to speak and to take the international law as a basis for our language, we have to respect it and we have not to be selective in that. Thank you.
What I'm going to do is we're going to end. If you want to speak to some of the panelists, you can afterwards. We've got to stop and get ready to roll. So thank you, everybody. Let's thank our guests and thank you, Shawan, for joining us. Okay.